Hello and welcome to this NET Back to Basics video focusing today on AQA Literature Paper 2, Section B, which is the Power and Conflict Poetry. As ever, the idea in each of these videos is that we'll be talking through a simple summary version of the key points about the topic as quickly as we can and look at how to approach this section of the exam. Now, to quickly recap AQA Literature Paper 2. So this paper lasts 2¼ hours, or about 2 hours 45 minutes, if you have that 25% extra time. Now the paper's split into 3 sections. Section A is the modern, Section B is anthology poetry, and Section C is unseen poetry. Now for most people watching this, that's going to be the combination of Section A on An Inspector Calls, Section B on the Power and Conflict poetry, and Section C on unseen poetry, as it is with everybody. Now, Section B, the one we're focusing on in this video, is worth 30 marks. Now, you're basically in this exam splitting your time into 3 because there's 3 sections. So you want to spend about 45 minutes on each of the sections, and that includes this one. Now, there are 2 possible options for Section B, and you need to answer on the one that you studied. Now, the 2 options are either love and relationships or power and conflict. Now, for the purpose of this video, I'm going to focus just on power and conflict, and you're usually going to find that on or around page 19 of the paper. You're only given 1 question on the power and conflict poetry, so you don't have any choice over which question you answer. Now, the question's always going to give you a named poem and a key theme, and the idea is that you then choose one of the remaining 14 poems from the anthology to compare to the named poem. And notice there's always a reference to comparison built into the question. A bit like providing an extract, the named poem is always provided on the same page as the question. If you're ever struggling from a memory point of view, don't forget that you're also given a list of the poems and the poets at the beginning of the section. The question's worth 30 marks, and you're marked on, firstly, how you make links between the texts and how you discuss those links. Secondly, the quotations you choose and how you use them. Thirdly, how you talk about the writer's choices, the techniques and the effect that they have. And lastly, how you discuss the big ideas in the text and or how you talk about the context. In terms of the essay that you write, you're probably going to manage around 4 to 6 paragraphs in total, which probably means 2 to 3 from the named poem and 2 to 3 from the other poem that you choose. A good bit of basic advice is to use the named poem to structure your answer, and a bit like following the narrative of one of the other texts, to follow the structure of the named poem. So start with the start, then go to the middle, and then talk about the end. Now, there isn't a single way to structure your response, but it can be dangerous to do the whole of the named poem first, and only then for the second half go on to your chosen poem. It's dangerous because if you have issues with your timing, your answer might end up really imbalanced, or equally, you might end up not integrating your comparison properly. For me, a better way to do it is to start at the beginning of the named poem, then make a comparison or a contrast with your chosen poem. Go back to the middle of the named poem, then make a comparison or a contrast to your chosen poem, then go to the end of the named poem and make a comparison or contrast with your chosen poem. Now sometimes you can just do start compared to start, middle compared to middle, and end compared to end. It doesn't work every time, but sometimes it does, so it's worth trying to think about that. So what can we prepare in advance? Well, we can't know in advance which poem the exam board will choose, or even what theme it could be. Although obviously they all link on some level to power and or conflict. Now obviously we know which poems and themes have been covered before, but poems can and have been repeated in previous years, so that doesn't actually help. However, I know that some of the big themes in the anthology would include human power and powerlessness, memory in the past, war and conflict, nature versus mankind, the individual and society, and inner conflict. Now, there's different ways of phrasing those, there's other options we could have, but that for me is pretty much the core set. So there isn't a single defined set of those key themes anywhere, but it's a good starting point. Now, if for each of those themes I know which poem or poems I'd choose, and then which quotation or quotations I choose from those poems, I can't really go far wrong. The other thing to think about is which poems do you find most useful to write about, or which ones are you most confident in writing about. For example, lots of people seem to find Remains quite memorable and therefore easy to quote, and it covers human power and powerlessness, memory in the past, war and conflict, and inner conflict. So it covers quite a few of the key themes. So that means I could compare it to lots of the other poems, which makes it really useful. Now, for the NET academies that I tend to work with, the recommended list of flexible poems, what we call the Super 6, would be Ozymandias, London, The Emigre, Remains, Exposure, and Storm on the Island. That's not to say that there aren't other really good and useful poems. So, for example, Kamikaze isn't on that list, and it's a really useful poem as well. But those ones do seem to cover most of the bases, lots of themes, lots of comparisons, and so on. And if for each of those poems I've got my 3 quotations from the start, the middle, and the end, I'm reasonably well set up. You'll also find, as a point, that certain poems pair up really well. So Remains and War Photographer is a really natural linking in terms of thematically, in terms of imagery. Ozymandias and My Last Duchess also works. And it's useful to think about, if a poem came up, which one is your automatic linking for that poem, if possible. So, for example, if I were looking at human power and powerlessness in a question, and I was given the poem Ozymandias, my plan might look something like this. So my named poem's Ozymandias, fine, got that in front of me, and I would choose, for me, I think, on that topic to compare it to London. Now I'm going to start with the named poem. So at the beginning of Ozymandias, it's clear that human power is temporary, that individuals don't matter. Okay. And the quotation I'd use is, half sunk, a shattered visage lies, matter of being forgotten, it's temporary, etc. For my second one, I then go for London. So in London, in contrast, Blake is keen to focus on powerless individuals as needing and deserving our sympathy. So for Blake, individuals are important. And the quotation I might go for is, mark in every face I meet, marks of weakness, marks of woe. I'm then going to go for the middle of Ozymandias. So, Shelley's poem focuses on the arrogant assertion of power over others. And the quotation, look on my works, ye mighty, and despair. I'm then going to go back to London. So, whereas London, in contrast, shows Blake keen to show the suffering caused by the assertion of that dominant power. So the quotation could be, in every voice, in every ban, the mind-forged manacles I hear. Now, my last little comparison is going to be, ultimately, so at the end of Ozymandias, Shelley suggests people are helpless against broader forces such as time and nature. And the quotation, boundless and bare, the lone and level sands stretch far away. In contrast, Blake presents the idea that people are weakened and restricted not by natural forces, but by other people. And the quotation could be, how the chimney sweepers cry every blackening church appalls, from London. So, as ever, to summarise what my basic line of discussion is going to be then, it would be, at the beginning of Ozymandias, it's clear that human power is temporary and that individuals don't matter. In London, in contrast, Blake is keen to focus on powerless individuals as needing and deserving our sympathy. So for Blake, individuals are important. Shelley's poem focuses on the arrogant assertion of power over others, whereas Blake is keen to show the suffering caused by that assertion of dominant power. Ultimately, Shelley suggests, people are helpless against broader forces such as time and nature. In contrast, Blake presents the idea that people are weakened and restricted not by natural forces, but by other people. As ever with these things, there are loads of useful and usable quotations in both poems, and other poems we could choose for comparison. But those 3 for each of those 2 poems are ones that I think track the whole of the poem and open up lots of concepts and connections. Obviously, as ever, I need to add analysis, features, techniques, methods, etc. I need words that I zoom in on, and I need to link, of course, to concepts and context, potentially. Let's try a second theme, and we'll go for the power of memory. Now, for this one, I'm going to imagine that my named poem, the one the exam board have given me, is The Emigre. So my plan would look a bit like this. So my named poem is The Emigre, and I'm going to try and link it to and compare it to and contrast it with Remains. So as ever, I'm going to start at the beginning of the named poem. At the beginning of the emigre, we're presented with the long-term impact and the apparent clarity that memory can offer. And the quotation, I left it as a child, but my memory of it is sunlight clear. For my second paragraph, I'm going to shift across to remains, where we see the same kind of clarity, though for a very different reason, early in remains, when I see every round as it rips through his life, I see broad daylight on the other side. For my third one, I'm going to go back to the emigre and closer to the middle now. So it's clear in the emigre that memories can be both positive and negative. They can be inaccurate, but that the emotional impact can linger. And the quotation, it may be sick with tyrants, but I'm branded by an impression of sunlight. I'll then, for my fourth one, go back across to remains. So this lingering impact of memory, the shadows that memories can cast, is also evident in remains when we get the line, end of story, except not really. His blood shadow stays on the street. Now for my fifth one, which is my final comparison in this little essay, I need to go back to the emigre and go for the end of it. So ultimately, Rumens suggests, our memories, even if inaccurate, need protecting, but can also be protective. And the quotation, my city hides behind me, they mutter death, and my shadow falls as evidence of sunlight. I'm then going to go for the end of remains. So whereas for Armitage's narrator, let's try that again, whereas for Armitage's narrator in remains, memories are inescapable and can be permanently scarring. And the quotation, his bloody life in my bloody hands. So my summary for my discussion, just to make sure it works, would be, at the beginning of the emigre, we're presented with the long-term impact and apparent clarity that memory can offer. We see the same kind of clarity, though for a very different reason, early in remains. It's clear in the emigre that memories can be both positive and negative, can be inaccurate, but that the emotional impact can linger. This lingering impact of memory, the shadows that memories can cast, is also evident in remains. Ultimately, Rumens suggests our memories, even if inaccurate, need protecting, but can also be protective, whereas for Armitage's narrator in remains, memories are inescapable and can be permanently scarring. Again, lots of different quotations we could use, different poems we could use, but I do think for this particular theme, those two poems work and those quotations work. As ever, obviously, that's simply the ideas in the quotations. I need to add the analysis, the features, the methods, the words to zoom in on. I'd also need to link to concepts and to context potentially as well. But that would be the spine of a good essay. Now, I'm not going to go through every single theme with quotations because there isn't really time on this video. But essentially, for me, if I had a choice, these are the poems from that Super 6 that I would link to these particular themes. So for Human Power and Powerlessness, I'd go Ozymandias and London. For Memory in the Past, I'd go for The Emigre and Remains. For War and Conflict, I'd go for Exposure and Remains. And notice that poems are repeating here. And that's one reason why these are so useful and flexible, these Super 6, because they fit multiple themes. So for Nature versus Humankind, I'd go for Storm on the Island and Exposure. Now Exposure is repeating. For the Individual and Society, I'd go London and the Emigre, and that's both London and the Emigre repeating. And then for Inner Conflict, I'd go Remains and Exposure. Now for each of those poems, I'll simply be trying to recycle and reapply the three key quotations I've memorised for each one, the quotations from the start, middle and the end. So that would be something along the lines of the ones on the screen. So for Ozymandias, half sunk, a shattered visage lies. Look at my works, ye mighty in despair. And then boundless and bare, flown on level sands stretch far away. For London, I'll go mark in every face I meet, marks of weakness, marks of woe. I'll then go for in every voice, in every band, the mind forged from manacles I hear. And my third one would be how the chimney sweepers cry, every blackening church appalls. For Exposure, I'd go for our brains ache in the merciless iced east winds that knife us. And as ever, the start of the poem, I'd then go for the middle of the poem, therefore not loath we lie out here, therefore we're born, for love of God seems dying. I'd end with all our eyes are ice, so all their eyes are ice, but nothing happens. For Storm on the Island, I would go for we are prepared, we build our houses squat, sink walls in rock, and again, start of the poem. I'd then go for the middle of the poem, the flung spray hits the very windows, splits like a tame cat turned savage, and then end with the end of the poem, strange, it's a huge nothing that we fear. For Remains, again, I'd go at the start, probably on, possibly not, or at least early on, then the middle, and the drink and the drugs won't flush him out, and then end with his bloody life in my bloody hands. And for the Emigre, I left it as a child, my memory of it is sunlight clear. I'd then go for, it may be at war, it may be sick with tyrants, but I'm branded by an impression of sunlight. And I'd end with, my city hides behind me, they mutter death, and my shadow falls as evidence of sunlight. Not perfect, but those three for each of those poems, and those poems linked to those themes, would basically set me up pretty neatly for whatever the exam will throw at me. Now, in terms of how we'd apply that and all of that to an essay question. So here's the question. I can see from it that the poem I've been given is Bayonet Charge and the theme is conflict. Okay, now, my two conflict poems that I've prepared are Exposure and Remains, and I could use either of them. I think in terms of the kind of warfare in Bayonet Charge, I'm going to go for Exposure as I think the easier choice. Now for Bayonet Charge, I've got the poem in front of me, but I already know the three quotations that I want to use from the start, the middle and the end, because I've revised. And those three would be, for me, Raw in raw seamed hot khaki, In what cold clockwork of the stars and the nations was he the hand pointing that second, and King, honour, human dignity, etc. dropped like luxuries. Now I'm comparing it to Exposure. I need to do this from memory, but I've got my three Exposure quotations memorised. So my first one would be, our brains ache in the merciless iced east winds at Nivus. My second one would be, therefore not loath we lie out here, therefore we're born, for love of God seems dying. And my third one is, all their eyes are ice, but nothing happens. So I'm going to basically go backwards and forwards between the two poems. Now I'd want to start, if possible, with an overview in which I point out which poems I'm linking and why. It's not essential, but it can be useful to basically signal to the examiner what I'm doing and where I'm going with it all. So something along the lines of, in both Bayonet Charge and Exposure, the poets present conflict as something both physically and mentally damaging. However, while Hughes in Bayonet Charge may focus primarily on the terror and discomfort of a soldier on the battlefield, Owen instead describes the wider conditions of the war and reflects on the impact from a more psychological and spiritual perspective. So the structure of this is simply, in the named poem and the poem I've chosen, the poets present the theme as, and then how do they present that theme. However, in the named poem, it's like this, whereas in the chosen poem, it's like this. Now the rest of my essay, the structure, would then simply follow my chosen quotations. So that would end up something along the lines of, at the beginning of Bayonet Charge, Hughes presents us with the physical and emotional discomfort of the soldier, as is described as raw in raw seamed hot khaki. And I talk about probably the metaphor of both him and his uniform being raw, the link to meat, and the view of the soldier as simply being, a thing, an item, something to be used, to be consumed. My second one would then be from my chosen poem. So Owen, similarly, shows us the same kind of suffering, both mental and physical, though unlike Hughes's poem, is caused here by the weather, and the quotation, our brains ache in the merciless iced east winds at Nivus. And I'll talk about, I think here, the personification of the weather, the lack of sympathy, the irony of the war imagery that's been used, etc. Third one, I'm going to go back to the named poem Bayonet Charge. Both of the soldiers are controlled by wider forces, and for the soldier in Bayonet Charge, part of his distress comes from his own helplessness. And the quotation would be, in what cold clockwork of the stars and the nations was he the hand pointing that second? And I talk about the image of the clockwork as emphasising his powerlessness against the wider forces of politics and destiny and so on. I talk about the idea of cold as uncaring and so on. Fourth one, back to Wilfred Owen. So however, and in contrast to the self-focused distress of the soldier in Bayonet Charge, Owen's anonymous soldier seems to find comfort in the sense of purpose that faith essentially gives him. So therefore not loath we lie out here, therefore we're born, for love of God seems dying. And I'll talk about this semantic field of life and death maybe, the juxtaposition of life and death, maybe the symbolic idea of sacrifice for faith. Fifth one, back to the named poem. Ultimately, Hughes, at the end of the poem, focuses on the way that conflict strips the soldier of every higher idea or dream, focusing only on his own survival. And the quotation, King, honour, human dignity, etc. dropped like luxuries. Now, this is an easy one. We've got the list, the simile of them being like luxuries, the beautifully dismissive, etc., the shifting perspective from when he signed up. Lots of ideas. And then for my last one, I'll go for the end of Exposure. And similarly for Owen, the soldiers are being deprived of everything, including their ability to engage emotionally and for others, being deprived of their lives, achieving, it seems, nothing despite the faith that attempts to sustain them. So the quotation, all their eyes are ice, but nothing happens. So I talk about the ambiguity around whose eyes. Is it the dead? Is it the soldiers? I might talk about ice as being both literal, frozen, and also metaphorical, as in emotionally numb, and so on. So, top tips to summarise. Firstly, answer on the correct poems. Make sure you talk about power and conflict. Secondly, compare the named poem to a chosen poem from the anthology, but just choose one for comparison. So you're only writing about 2 poems. Thirdly, spend 45 minutes answering this question, or around 56 if you have extra time. Next, have your key poems identified and your quotations and combinations rehearsed. It's worth practicing with themes. Aim for and plan for between 4 and 6 paragraphs. That means 2 to 3 quotations from the named poem and 2 to 3 from the chosen poem. Use the named poem to structure your response. Go from the start to the middle to the end. And remember to analyse features, words, ideas, etc. If you're aiming higher, the advice is the same as in pretty much all of these videos. Focus on the depth and the range. Analysis is important, and you need to weave it throughout your response. That said, as ever, you're not necessarily marked higher for discussions around obscure technical features. It's the effect and the impact that's important. So you can talk about the irregular dactylic dimeter with a falling rhythm in the Charge of the Light Brigade if you really want to, but it's the rhythmic driving of the hoofbeats that's the effect. The interesting bit that's getting you marks is that idea of the rhythm and the hoofbeats, much more than the throwing around of impressive sounding terminology. Now, showing you have an understanding of how the whole poem slots together is useful, and consider multiple layers of meaning. That's always a safe one. A nice idea is to focus on tracking concepts, themes, and images or motifs, and that can be a useful way of showing that you have those multiple layers of meaning, that developing idea. Context for the poems is useful. It adds a level sometimes to consider something like Wilfred Owen being a serving soldier, or the idea that Remains is based on a soldier's real life account. However, this is, again, not a history essay. So regurgitating John Agard's life story onto the page isn't going to add anything to your analysis of the poem, so be selective. A couple of really well-chosen, refined points is much more preferable than just loading it with loads and loads and loads of history. As ever, themes and concepts are a much safer way of addressing and accessing the high marks for AO3 than external context. And thank you very much for your time today. Hopefully that's been useful. Don't forget that, as ever, there's a whole range of videos covering pretty much all the topics you could possibly wish for on the NET English YouTube channel, which is Net English 1. Take care.